Good morning, Bucknutters. It is Friday, December 23rd, 2016. I am Dan Rubin. This is the Bucknuts Morning 5 and change. Yes, I am back. This will be my last of the 5-day marathon of shows with Dave Biddle on vacation. He'll be back Monday from a holiday weekend. However, this morning we are blessed to bring in Brandon Castel, B-Cast, to his legion of followers. Brandon, how are you this fine morning?
Doing great, Dan. Thanks for having me on, buddy.
No problem. And there's been a host of stuff that's actually gone on recently. We've spent a lot of time talking recruiting on the BM5 this week. I want to get to some other topics, the biggest one being the addition of Billy Davis to the staff. We've known about this for quite some time. He's kind of been serving as a consultant to the team this season. People should know this. Billy Davis is no amateur. This is a guy who is a lifer in the NFL. We know that he met Urban Meyer at the University of Cincinnati. They both played there together. Davis was the best man at his wedding. But what is your feeling about a guy who spent 1 year as a grad assistant at Michigan State and then since 1992 through 2015 was in the NFL? Is this a trend with the Schiano thing? Was this inevitable because of Urban and Billy's relationship? What's your vibe on the Davis hiring to replace Fickell?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's probably more of an anomaly. I think, that relationship between Urban Meyer and Billy Davis, I think is probably the big connection point. Schiano is a guy, who coached at the college level, obviously, who was the, most well known for his time at Rutgers and as the defensive coordinator at Miami. I would say more of his success came at the college level than the pro level. With Billy Davis, I think it's more of an opportunity to bring in a guy with a ton of experience, a guy who's from Ohio, who grew up in Youngstown, who played at Cincinnati, who, obviously understands the landscape, and more importantly, I think who really has a great relationship with Urban, who really he can trust, he can lean on. When you lose a guy like Luke Fickell, who's talk about a lifer who's been at Ohio State forever and has been a guy who will do anything and cut himself whatever he has to in order to help the university and really grind it out to make Ohio State great. You got to get a good replacement. You got to get a guy who brings something to the table and who you can trust and lean on. I think that's probably the most important factor for Urban. The fact he was already working with the team as a consultant, he knows the guys. He's been involved in at least, what the conversations are, the recruiting. He knows the current team. I think there's a lot of synergy. There's not going to be, a big, growing period or kind of, breaking in period with getting him into that role as there would be if Urban were to say, open it up and try to go out and pull a guy from another university. I mean, I think the biggest thing to me is not only has he coached in the NFL, but he's coached linebackers for a really long time. I mean, you go back to his earliest days in the league. I mean, with Pittsburgh, Carolina, and Cleveland, he was a linebackers coach and has really coached linebackers at the highest level. I mean, how often when you're in college you lose a coach and you can get a guy who's been a defensive coordinator in the NFL in 3 different locations over the last 10 years. So, he was the defensive coordinator in San Francisco, defensive coordinator in Arizona under Ken Wisenhunt, and then more recently in Philadelphia. So I think that alone is kind of a no-brainer when you can get a guy with that kind of experience, especially, I thought all along they were going to have to start thinking ahead. If Schiano does take a head coaching job for next year, what are you going to do with that coordinator spot? You don't have Luke Fickell anymore. You obviously lost Chris Ash last year. Schiano's going to be a hot name if things continue to trend the way they're going. Maybe this is a little bit of a preemptive move, a guy who's called plays defensively at the highest level. Always good to have on your staff.
I completely agree with that. I think Davis is obviously going to be the defensive coordinator in waiting. There's 2 ways to look at it. Anytime someone hires someone they're very close to, it can be a challenge. I would say that Luke Fickell, although his name was well known among Buckeyes, in terms of what his actual position was with the team, linebacker coach and kind of co-defensive coordinators with heavy air quotes on that. I think Urban's relationship with Billy Davis, like you said, allowed them to bring in someone who's overqualified for the position again. And it's kind of been waiting to get an even bigger spot. I don't know how easy it would have been to go on the open market and get a linebackers coach that's qualified as Billy Davis is to do this. I venture to guess that would be impossible. And I also think this, every move you make at Ohio State has to be with one eye on getting your players to the NFL. I say this over and over again. Every kid that commits to Ohio State thinks he's 3 years from the league. The idea that you're hiring someone, I mean, Davis's dad, the reason he was from in Cleveland, his dad was a vice president of player personnel for the Browns, so this guy has it in his blood. I would agree with you. I think it's a very interesting and solid hire. I also think your point about him being a consultant for the year, so he's not hitting the ground, completely running, or completely in place for that matter, is excellent. Here's our TMZ-ish Buckeye aspect of the show. This cracks me up. Brian Hartline, those of you remember, a receiver who made himself some coin in the NFL, has been back practicing with the Buckeyes, as has become the new practice among the elite powers. Bring back some recently outed pros to work against your players. He is, believe it or not a huge fan of his former teammate Terrelle Pryor, and has said that he thinks his success in the NFL is a flash in the pan. For those who don't remember, Hartline and Brian Rubisky were on the Todd Beckman train when the ball was handed to Terrelle Pryor, and I believe as the locker room was split over that, Hartline was lined up directly on the Beckman side. What's your impression of all that? Is it a bad look for Ohio State? Water under the bridge? Should it be for Hartline? What's your vibe on those two?
Yeah, that's great. And I was right in the mix of that. I remember, that 2008 season was, one of the more interesting seasons because Beckman was such a likable guy, whether it was with the media. I mean, he wasn't overly talkative, but he was a guy you could tell that people liked him. He was liked in the locker room. And Pryor came in as just, the cockiest kid in the world, entitlement and even though he was a grinder and it sounded like he was working hard and, Jim Tressel said all the right things, you could see why a Brian Hartline or an Alex Boone or some of the guys who have come out and pretty openly bashed Terrelle Pryor. If you forget, Alex Boone, I think, is the one who said, I hated everything about Terrelle Pryor. That there was a lot not to like about him as a young kid. So I'm not surprised at some of these things. And then I think, you add in the scandal and look at the way that all went down. And I think Pryor, because he was such a big name, because he was the quarterback, the leader of the team at the time, he shouldered a lot of that. There wasn't as much thrown, in my opinion, at guys like Mike Adams and DeVere Posey and Boom Herron. So I think there's a lot of people who kind of painted him as the bad guy and as the poster child for everything that went wrong. And, I think as time has gone on, people have been a little bit more willing to forgive and kind of look back and say, okay, he sold some memorabilia. He got some free tattoos. Yes, Jim Tressel got fired because of it, but, Jim Tressel deserves some blame. The rest of the guys deserve some blame. And, I think people have lightened up a little bit on Pryor, but I can see why guys like Hartline, have harbored some bitterness towards him. So I do think it's a little bit of a bad look for Hartline. Not so much for Ohio State. I get it. I think that there's probably a lot of guys who played before Brian Hartline, with Brian Hartline, who feel that way about Terrelle Pryor, and nothing's going to change their mind. I don't cover him now playing for the Browns, but he seems like he's grown up a little bit. But, more importantly, I think Brian Hartline is just flat out wrong on some of the things he said. Now, I do agree. I wouldn't pay Terrelle Pryor to be a number one receiver and give him a boatload of money because I'm totally convinced he's a stud NFL receiver, but I think he's a lot better than people anticipated when he made the switch from quarterback to receiver. And I think there's potential that he could be a pretty effective receiver in the NFL if he can, get some more training and sure up some things. And maybe he won't be. Maybe maybe it's a flash in the pan, like he said, and guys figured him out. But with his size and speed, I think there's a chance he could be pretty good.
I agree with you. Let's separate the two here. First, let's just talk about Terrelle as a pro. The people are always going to give you a chance when you have his kind of physical capabilities. Yes, he was a complete knucklehead when he was here, and he made some terrible decisions. But in terms of just raw athleticism, I still can't remember anybody at 6'5" who moves like that. So, I mean, it's taken him how many years? We're looking at 5-6 years into a pro career for him to get to the point where he was even considered a real full-time receiver. And I think the fact that Cleveland was in such straits and can dedicate time to a guy like that worked in his favor. But I think Hartline he's incorrect in that Pryor's going to have an NFL career for the next few years at least, provided he can keep his nose clean. And he has done that off the field. You know, he's been a schmuck a lot of the time, but he's not done stuff that's going to actually get you to miss games. I mean, there's been, you know, him and Pac-Man Jones getting into the media and stuff. I mean, Pryor is prone to make some of the silliest. I'll never forget the guy pulling up in the car at the meeting about not taking stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Once you do that, once you show up and the media is gathered for a time when people are going to be talking about taking too much free stuff in a car that's obviously beyond your means, you know, not the best decision maker. But I would say that's a little bit of Hartline to let that bleed into his NFL personnel abilities there. I think Pryor's got himself a nice career going for a while. Speaking of extending nice careers for a while, we all know that when the bowl games or playoffs are announced, you then get some extended practice time. That gives young guys on the roster a chance to shine. It gets them more reps in practice. From what you're hearing and what you expect, who are a couple guys that maybe haven't played a huge role this season, younger guys that you could see having a breakout in the playoffs or even into next year?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really is always interesting to see kind of who makes that jump, because this is the time of year where you could really set yourself up for a big spring. And that doesn't always translate into the guy on the field, but you know, in the fall. But it definitely gives you a jump start, a head start on some of the other guys, and especially when you've got a team like Ohio State has had really the last couple of years, where you're going to see a pretty big exodus, at least of talent at some certain spots heading to the NFL, and kind of see guys make that jump in the next coming year to fill some of those spots. I mean, there's a lot of guys in this team that I could see, you know, especially depending on how many of these guys go. I mean, I think you're going to see a number of guys from the secondary go, and a handful of guys from the rest of the defense, and so it'll be interesting to see who kind of makes that jump. I've been waiting on Ferris Campbell for a while to make that jump. I don't know if now's the time. I mean, I haven't seen enough to really kind of warrant that to make me really get excited about him, but I've been waiting for him to be a guy that makes the jump, because they just need some of these young receivers to come along. They need somebody to start making plays out there along with Noah Brown, and they've got to have some go-to guys. And I think we've talked a little bit on the show about KJ Hill, and how I think early in kind of middle of the season, Dave and I talked a lot about KJ Hill being the guy we thought might emerge from that group, and he kind of did a little bit, and I think he kind of could take that next step. But you know, Benjamin Victor is a guy that I really like to take a step, not only maybe to make some plays and get on the field a little bit this year, but especially for next year. I think he could be, you know, you got Johnny Dixon, Terry McLaurin, a couple of these other guys that are still young kids in terms of their playing careers, and you know, have a couple more years to really make an impact. And we'll see what happens with them. McLaurin's shown a little bit. We know Johnny Dixon can stretch the field, but you know, I think Ben Victor is a kid who could make that jump. You know, another guy I like that I think is a playmaker and really is going to have to make a jump depending on what happens with, you know, Curtis Samuel is Demario McCall. I know that there's been, you know, he's a young kid. Ball security is always an issue. Knowing the playbook's always an issue. You know, trusting a kid that's you know, that green and that fresh, you know, is not always what the coaches want to do during his rookie season, especially in a season like this. But that's a kid who every time he touched the ball this year offensively, I said, okay, this kid's got something. You know, he's got that little bit of something that you like to see, that little wiggle, that explosiveness. So wouldn't be surprised to see him get, you know, some looks, and especially if there's more opportunities next year with, you know, Dontre not being around, and we'll see what Curtis Samuel, you know, does in the bowl game and makes any decisions on that. But you know, I like Demario a lot. And then the other area I would say is offensive line. You know, I really think they've got to have some of these young guys come along, and guys like Brandon Bowen and Matt Burrell and, you know, Malcolm Pridgeon coming back from injury. I really think they need those guys to take a step, because they're obviously going to be losing a couple of really good players up front. You know, they've still got to get Isaiah Prince to take that step. I mean, that's a concern for me heading into this game. But I think the offensive linemen have to really make a jump. Maybe not for this game in particular. I don't see them making any changes, obviously, for the playoffs, but really for next spring, they've got to have those guys ready to roll. So those are the kind of the guys that I think. I mean, maybe a guy like Eric Smith, Jordan Fuller. There's some guys in the secondary I think that can set themselves up nicely for the spring and maybe have a little bit more of a role even in the rest of this season. So a lot of guys that, this team is pretty loaded with talent, as we know, and more guys coming in. So
no doubt. I'll just finish by saying this. I think it would do a lot for Buckeye Nation and the offense in general to see Ben Victor streaking down the sidelines and catching a deep ball early against Clemson. We need someone to take the top off the defense. They have not had that aspect of the defense since Devin Smith left. I thought it would be easier to replace. Apparently it's not. And I totally agree with you on Isaiah Prince. To me, this is going to be a referendum on the offensive line coaching. If they can't do something with Prince in the X number of weeks they had between the end of the Michigan game and the kickoff against Clemson, because let's all know this, Clemson is not a team without defensive ends, without speed. And they also have access to videotape. So they know Isaiah Prince is a weak link on the line. If there's not a drastic improvement made there, I think it could cost Ohio State in the game, and I wouldn't be surprised to see there be some effect on the offensive line coaching in general. We appreciate BCast for stopping by. Reminder to Bucknuts, just have a wonderful and safe holiday weekend. Dave will be back on Monday. Thank God for that. Have a good one, Bucknutters.